In order for us to use the molecules and energy we get from food, we must transport them across cell membranes. Transport of nutrients is essential for all cells, but we'll use cells in the small intestine to teach the principles of membrane transport. Let's zoom into the surface of an intestinal cell. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable. Some molecules can move across it, while others cannot. How do materials enter and leave cells? Lipids, such as these yellow molecules, can move freely across the lipid bilayer. Notice that the lipid molecules move down their concentration gradient from where they are more concentrated to where they are less concentrated. This is an example of simple diffusion. Diffusion is a form of passive transport. It does not require energy from the cell, but it does depend on the concentration gradient, size and charge of the molecule or ion. However, most molecules cannot cross the lipid bilayer. Instead, molecules like the sugar fructose move into intestinal cells by facilitated diffusion, moving down their concentration gradient and through transport proteins. It also differs because it acts only on specific molecules, and the transport proteins can become saturated, reducing the amount of diffusion. However, facilitated diffusion doesn't require energy from the cell, so, like simple diffusion, it's a form of passive transport. The majority of water molecules cross the plasma membrane by facilitated diffusion, also called osmosis, through specific protein channels called aquaporins. Some ions, such as sodium and potassium, require transport against their concentration gradients. The sodium-potassium pump actively transports these ions from where they are less concentrated to where they are more concentrated. This process requires energy from the cell and is known as active transport. Energy from ATP is used to move 3 sodium ions, shown in red, out of the cell, and 2 potassium ions, shown in blue, into the cell. Because the pump uses ATP directly, this type of transport is called primary active transport. Another type of active transport, secondary active transport, also moves chemicals against gradients. It doesn't use ATP as a direct source of energy. Instead, it uses the downhill gradient from one ion or molecule to drive the uphill movement of another ion or molecule. For example, sodium and glucose move into the cell by secondary active transport in a process called cotransport or symport, because both substances are moving in the same direction. Sodium ions move down their concentration gradient created by the sodium-potassium pump, but because glucose concentrations inside the cell can quickly exceed those outside the cell, glucose moves against its concentration gradient. The cell moves larger materials, such as proteins, from the intracellular fluid to the extracellular fluid, using vesicles that fuse with the plasma membrane and release their contents outside the cell. This process is called exocytosis. In endocytosis, the plasma membrane pinches in, forming a vesicle that contains material from outside the cell. Cells use all these processes, passive and active transport, exocytosis and endocytosis, to move materials across their membranes.